Welcome back to my channel where I make a variety of flying related videos while flying my Jabiru aircraft. A quick note, I shoot all of my videos in 4K, so to get the best viewing experience make sure YouTube is set to the highest quality. This video is of a flight from North Weald to the disused airfield at Leiston in Suffolk, navigating via a number of World War II airfields in Essex and Suffolk. Today, many of these airfields are difficult to locate from the ground as they've reverted to their original natural state or agricultural use, repurposed as industrial sites, gravel extraction, used for commercial aviation, private flying, or a combination of any of the above. I trained for my PPL at Southend Flying Club, where I had an instructor who was very enthusiastic about historical aviation. So it seemed only natural when he would get me to plan cross-country flights to incorporate disused airfields as waypoints. The route on the chart starts from North Weald rather than my training airfield of Southend and includes RAF Chipping-Ongar, or Willingale as the private strip is now called. RAF Chipping-Ongar, or Willingale, is very near North Weald, being about 4 minutes flying time after turnout. So I usually fly north or south of the airfield, but on this day I flew over the strip. RAF Chipping-Ongar was one of 15 airfields in Essex used during World War II by the United States Army Air Force and was built in 1942. In mid-1942, B-26 Marauders of the 387th Bombardment Group carried out attacks on the French coast from Chipping-Ongar for about 11 months before moving to Stony Cross in July 1944. The airfield was little used for the rest of the war, except in 1944 when the 9th Troop Carrier Command used Chipping-Ongar as an advanced C-47 base during Operation Market Garden, the airborne invasion of the Netherlands. "15-seat Waco Hadrian gliders were stored at Willingale in readiness for the Arnhem invasion, but these were never used. Later in March 1945, as part of Operation Varsity, the airborne crossing of the Rhine, Troop Carrier Group used Chipping-Ongar to transport British paratroops. After the war, the airfield remained largely unoccupied, and in February 1959 the RAF handed the land back. As well as the agricultural use, up until 2008 the airfield was used by various small operators, and a short grass strip is still active today, being used by microlights and GA aircraft. A trivial fact that those of you who drive along the A12 Brentwood bypass may be driving over concrete removed from the runway used in its construction during the 1960s. At this point I'm about 3 miles from Willingale, with the direction of flight roughly indicated by the red arrow, with the present day strip being at the head of the arrow beside part of the World War II perimeter track. I've overlaid the positions of the present day grass strip and the main World War II runway on the archive drawing of the site. From this direction, all the World War II airfield runways would have been beyond the present day grass strip, circled in red. The present day parking and hangars have made use of part of the World War II concrete that formed as spectacled dispersal sites. The main runway used to run along a line between the green field and the brown ploughed field adjacent. As I turned left and the perimeter track ends, the outline of where the missing section of track used to be can just be seen in the field. Where this outline turns and curves right, just before the small wood, you can see where it would have joined the perimeter track on the opposite side of the airfield, which is where the main runway ended. The next leg of the flight is just under 10 nautical miles from Willingale on a heading of about 72 degrees, which means about 5 or 6 minutes flying time. I think RAF Boreham is much easier to spot now compared to when I first started flying. In the late 70s, most of the fields surrounding the runways were being used for agriculture, whereas now it's one big quarry that contrasts well against the surrounding fields. The inset archive photograph shows the typical A-plan layout of the World War II runways with the curved perimeter tracks that make these airfields so distinctive. Like many of the East Anglian airfields, Boreham was built in 1943-44 and was briefly used by the United States Army Air Force 394th Bomber Group, flying B-26 Marauders, as well as being a troop transport airfield for paratroops. After the war, the airfield closed in late 1945. Between 1949 and 1952, motor racing was carried out at Boreham on the 4.76 km perimeter track, which included drivers such as Sterling Moss and Mike Hawthorne, for anyone who's old enough to remember them. In 1955, the Ford Motor Company bought the airfield to use as a test facility for trucks, as well as the base for their competitions department where they prepared their racing cars. Essex Police operated a twin squirrel helicopter from Boreham between late 1989 and 2012, and in 1992 a hangar to house this helicopter was constructed beside the control tower. This can be seen in my inset photograph which I took in 2006. National Police Air Service took over the site and continued to operate there until August 2018, after which time they moved to Lippets Hill and North Weald. The Essex Air Ambulance was based at Boreham, its first flight being in 1998. In 2007 it merged with the newly formed Herts Air Ambulance Trust to form the Essex and Herts Air Ambulance Trust. With a newly acquired second helicopter, the following year one helicopter started operating from North Weald, and in 2011 the Essex Air Ambulance moved from Boreham to Earls Colne. During the 1990s the airfield began to be dismantled for gravel extraction, but you can see from my 2006 photograph that many of the fields surrounding the main runway were still being used for agriculture, with some gravel removal having taken place at the north end of the runway. The control tower reported as being knocked down as late as 2023. During my fifth flight out of Stapleford in 1979, I actually landed at Boreham with my instructor and another instructor to retrieve a lost trainee pilot who had landed at Boreham. I remember the red-faced, unsympathetic security guard ranting and raving at the poor trainee and the flight instructor we'd flown in to pick up the stranded student and aircraft. I've orientated the inset plan so the main runway lines up with the outline of the runway on the ground, which shows how little of the World War II concrete remains. This approach is heading north towards the airfield, crossing over the A12 with the post office depot to the left. Again, I've positioned the inset World War II aerial photo to match the main runway 34 on the video. From here, flying a heading of 34 degrees, it's about 6 miles to the next airfield, RAF Rivenhall. During World War II, RAF Rivenhall was used by both the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Force, being primarily a combat airfield with various fighter and bomber units based there during the war. After the war, it was closed in 1946 and kept in reserve until 1956, when Marconi took over most of the site to use as a factory and a test and demonstration site. Most of the World War II buildings have now gone due to the extensive quarrying, but parts of the perimeter track has been reduced to single width for agricultural access. Some of the loop hardstands still remain in the southwestern area of the site near to the Marconi Hangar 1. The next airfield, RAF Birch, requires a right turn to the east and is about 3 minutes flying away. The construction of RAF Birch as a heavy bomber base started in 1943, and like most of the East Anglian airfields was used by both the RAF and Americans, primarily as a reserve transport airfield towards the end of the war. Birch was the last of the UK airfields to be completed by the US Army. Due mainly to the delay in finishing the hard standings, the airfield was not fully operational until June 1944, by which time there were enough alternative airfields in East Anglia to make Birch surplus to requirements. Birch's only major operation was by the RAF in March 1945 for Operation Varsity, the airborne crossing of the Rhine, when 60 Dakotas took off from Birch, towing plywood Horsa gliders, taking part in the last major airborne operation of the war. After delivering the gliders, most of these returning Dakotas were directed to land at other bases following this operation, and the RAF No. 46 Group withdrew from Birch during the next few days. There is an original Horsa glider in the Museum of Army Flying, Middle Wallop, and there's also a full-size replica in the Memorial Pegasus at Ranville in Lower Normandy, which is the one shown in the photograph. Birch was closed after the war in late 1945, and as you can see, very little of the original concrete remains. What used to be RAF Boxted is another 5 minutes away, flying in a roughly northeasterly direction. It's not easy to spot until you get close to the site. RAF Boxted was a very active airfield which opened in 1943, initially with the Americans flying marauders on bombing raids on airfields, convoys, tanks, trains, etc. After 3 months, the 354th Fighter Group came to Boxted flying the Merlin engine P-51B Mustangs, which because of their long range capability were able to escort the bombers on their missions over the continent and also well into Germany. The 354th stayed until March 1944, when they moved to an advanced landing ground at Lashington in Kent to prepare for D-Day. In March 1944, the 56th Group arrived at Boxted, where they stayed until the end of the war in Europe, finally returning home by the end of October 45, at which time the airfield was handed back to the RAF. The airfield finally closed in late 1947, and not much of it remains, as it's almost been completely returned to agriculture. The photographs and video show the two refurbished Nissan huts that house the Boxted Airfield Museum. I've circled the Nissan huts and post-war buildings on the south side of the airfield that are currently being used as commercial premises, utilising what was a section of the aircraft concrete hard standing. The route flown as shown in my video differs slightly from the route taken during my training flights, which would have been a direct track from overhead Boxted to Felixstowe, then from Felixstowe to RAF Leiston via Alford Ness. My flight instructor made the disused airfield at Leiston the final point of the navigation exercise before turning directly back to Southend, the whole flight being just over the hour. The reason we didn't fly the direct route as shown in my 2024 flight was to avoid Ipswich, Woodbridge and Bentwaters airfields, which were still active at that time. The Orwell Bridge in Ipswich is very slightly to the left of the track to Woodbridge, and I remember flying into Ipswich Airport when the bridge was being constructed. Ipswich Airport was actually my first solo land-away airport, and I remember being incredibly nervous being out of the circuit solo for the first time. And this was pre-GPS, all charts and stopwatches. I remember requesting airfield information for my flight back to Southend Airport over the radio, only to be instructed to shut down the engine and return to the terminal, where I was informed there were heavy thunderstorms passing over the Southend area. Some 2.5 hours later, my flight instructor telephoned me from Southend Flying Club to let me know the weather had passed and I could return, thus avoiding an overnight in Ipswich. There's very little sign of Ipswich Airport today, save for the replacement terminal building, which was built after the original terminal building, which I believe was Grade 2 listed, was knocked down. The new terminal building was actually built for office space long after the airfield had closed and never saw an aircraft take off or land. Ipswich Airport has a long interesting history going back to 1929 until its eventual closure, with the last Cessna 150 taking off in 1998. There's plenty of extremely interesting information online referring to the nearly 70 years as an airfield. It's worth reading more. Here I am passing over the River Deben just to the north of Ipswich on a direct track to RAF Woodbridge, about 5 minutes from Ipswich. It differs from the previous airfields in this video. RAF Woodbridge was actually opened in late 1943 as a satellite of RAF Bentwaters, and it's primarily as an emergency landing ground for aircraft damaged in combat returning from Europe. It had extra wide and long runways with 500-yard extensions to both ends of the runway to accommodate shot-up aircraft returning with airframe damage or low fuel that might overshoot or undershoot when landing. As you can see in my video, the 2-mile-long runway has unobstructed approaches from both east and west, and by the end of World War II, 4,200 aircraft had carried out emergency landings at Woodbridge. On the 14th of March 1948, the airfield was put into care and maintenance status. During the Cold War, Woodbridge was home to the 79th Fighter Squadron and squadrons of the 81st Fighter Wing of the United States Air Force. After the Americans left in 1993, the UK Ministry of Defence took back control of the airfield. It was announced that the site would close by 2027, but the barracks were later announced to remain open. Since the 1st of September 2006, RAF Woodbridge is now officially known as MOD Woodbridge, including Woodbridge Airfield and Rock Barracks. It's now home to the newly formed 23rd Engineer Regiment of the British Army. You can see various green army vehicles in my inset photo. As I fly towards the east end of the runway, I pass over the hardened Cold War aircraft shelters, which would have housed aircraft ready for an immediate takeoff in response to any threat. These third generation shelters, 17 originally built at Woodbridge, had their doors removed in around 2010 for scrap. It's difficult to appreciate how big these shelters are from 1,000 feet above, but they're 120 foot long by 71 feet wide. As I turn over the east end of the runway, you can see how near RAF Bentwaters it is to RAF Woodbridge. The site that became RAF Bentwaters originated around the end of World War I, which must have been shortly after the RAF was actually formed. This station was a grass airfield known as RAF Butley. Then in 1942 construction began on the site, and in 1943 RAF Butley was renamed RAF Bentwaters, opening for operational use in April 1944, being used by various RAF squadrons during World War II. After World War II, Bentwaters was used by the United States Air Force during the Cold War, with the 81st Fighter Wing based there, which also operated from RAF Woodbridge, resulting in the two airfields being known by the Americans as the twin bases. During their occupation, the Americans first operated the F-86 Sabres. Then in 1974 the 81st began operating F-4D Phantoms, followed by the A-10A Thunderbolt single-seat attack aircrafts in 1979. At the end of the Cold War, the American presence was phased down, with the last A-10 aircraft departing Bentwaters in March 1993, and the site was then handed back to the Ministry of Defence for closure. The site's now known as Bentwaters Parks and houses various businesses, as well as the site being used to make films and television programmes. There's a Cold War museum on site which I understand is very interesting and is high on my list of places to visit. Shame I can't fly in. A very small dot that can be seen on the coast in the distance is just behind the last airfield on this trip, RAF Leiston. The white dot is actually the Sizewell nuclear power station some 10 nautical miles away, situated right at the water's edge. Just for the record, I took the inset photograph of the power station with a long lens and was not within the power station restricted area. In October 1943, the completed RAF Leiston airfield was handed over to the United States Army Air Force and was designated Station 373, being built to the Class A airfield standard. The 358th Fighter Group arrived at Leiston at the end of November 1943, initially engaging in escort work until their departure in January 1944. The 357th Fighter Group arrived at Leiston at the end of January 1944, and it consisted of the 362nd, 63rd and 64th Fighter Squadrons, initially providing target and withdrawal support for bombers carrying out raids to the continent, including raids into Germany. The group also flew ground attack missions on a variety of strategic targets on the continent as well as into the heart of Germany, courtesy of the long-range P-51 Mustangs. The group received 2 distinguished unit citations for missions flown from Leiston. The man who first broke the sound barrier, Chuck Yeager, and Bud Anderson were stationed at Leiston. When you fly over the site now, it's hard to imagine all that activity that would have been happening in 1944. There were 10 living sites located west of the airfield that housed about 1,700 personnel. I can highly recommend the website toflyandfight.com, especially the video section by Bud Anderson. The archive photos I have included in this video are from this website, and there are many more, and I believe there's also an audiobook by Bud Anderson which I am going to track down and purchase. The video gives an insight into what it must have been like for young men flying these missions, as well as giving some understanding of how the raids were coordinated, taking into account the large number of different types of aircraft with different performance characteristics. His account details his missions from Leiston, but it's easy to forget that multiple airfields might have been involved in the same mission, and they would all need to be synchronised to arrive at the target at about the same time. Bud Anderson's description of flying the missions can just as easily be applied to any of the World War II UK airfields, including the handful I've described in this short video. At the end of the war, Leiston was handed back to the RAF, and after a period of being in care and maintenance status, closed for good in 1955. Like most of the airfields in my video, Leiston can be recognised from the air but very difficult to identify from the ground. There are many more airfields on either side of the track I've flown in this video, some now completely unidentifiable, others like Southend, Earls Cone and Stansted are familiar to most, albeit much changed since the 1940s. I find it difficult to imagine how busy the East Anglian skies must have been during the larger operations involving hundreds of aircraft all heading towards the same target. As private pilots, we all know how stressful it can be in a busy circuit at a weekend on a fine weather day, but I don't think the stress levels compare in any way with a large World War II operation to the continent like those carried out from the East Anglian airfields. Apart from the task of finding the target and not bumping into other aircraft, these wartime pilots had to contend with the real possibility of being shot out of the sky.